Would you consider yourself a revolutionary?
Well, no, but I do believe corporations rob us of our dignity and independence, and that these systems must be ripped down, burnt down, or leveled by any force necessary.
Preach it, boo-boo! Kinda stuck right now in terms of which I prefer between truth and the whole world is watching. Episode 4 definitely felt more focused, with basically all the movers and shakers of the plot in one place, bouncing off each other in really interesting thematic ways. It was the fun and games stretch of the story, which is often my favorite part in a narrative. But Episode 5 is the just as effective step back, the much needed breathing room and setup for what looks to be a doozy of a climax. I mean, yeah, we've got an opening fight that's ludicrously brutal, though I imagine they wanted it to be a real highlight since it leads into a decidedly less action-focused episode. I'm a big fan of when the MCU, or any comic property, does the fights with lots of heightened, flashy powers and inventive, colorful imagery, but it's gotta be said that a lot of their best, most emotionally resonant fights involve the relatively less powered characters just slugging it out. This one involves a lot of neat uses of the setting, and Sam does prove pretty ingenious with his rocket pack, even sans wings, but obviously the highlight of the fight is Walker's arm snapping and the final tag team move which leaves everyone, including me, winded to hell and back. It's just so visceral and tactile in a way that these fights rarely get. And I also like breaking Walker's arm as a symbol for how the rest of him is snapping as a result of his own stubbornness and need to hold onto the shield. Now granted, Walker is not wrong to call the government out on being massive hypocrites for their attempts to disavow him, even if that call-out is itself rather hypocritical due to his own constant disavowing of things throughout the episode. I, for one, can't help but feel bad for him. Yeah, he screwed up big time all throughout the series up to this point, and a wiser man would go about things differently than he's doing, but just like Sam and Bucky, he's now a veteran that's denied even benefits for his service all due to one mistake. Stefan Krosex, who I've been a fan of for a long time, made a great point about how Sam getting the government's approval to be Captain America would be more morally condemning than it would be validating at this point. Cap and the Shield as symbols need to be decoupled from the government. Walker is, more by their fault than his own, the inevitable result of a government-sanctioned cap, symbolizing only them and their priorities until they have no more use for him. This show comes closer than any other MCU property to coming outright and saying what really needs to be said, and honestly it makes the whole debate about who the show's true villain is feel silly in retrospect. The villain isn't Walker, and it isn't Carly, it's not even the power broker, who's probably Sharon. It's this guy, and everything they represent. Like, I understand people's complaints that Carly and the Flag Smashers' goals and rhetoric seem a bit vague and thinly spread at points, but I think that only happens because they really are fighting something so ubiquitous and all-encompassing as world governments. People and systems which demonstrably over the course of the show, and, reality, treat individuals as disposable, set them up to fail, and then play benevolent authority when things screw up largely because of their own decisions. The government and the GRC created a world where the Flag Smashers were deemed necessary. The government created John Walker and then threw him into a position he was not prepared for to make themselves look good. It's implied they hastened Sam's relinquishing of the shield, too. Hell, if the government could disappear Walker the same way they disappeared Isaiah Bradley, you know they would in an instant. And yet they are so deeply entrenched in every facet of the world that we can't imagine what one without them looks like. We can't imagine what a world looks like where the Flag Smashers ultimately win, and so they seem to many of us to not make sense. Frankly, I almost feel bad for the creatives working on the show for that reason. They've done such a good job of pointing the finger in the right place, of creating a conflict full of shades of gray produced and exacerbated by the one truly evil party, but that party is so deeply ingrained in our understanding of the modern world that they probably wrote themselves into a corner. I mean, if this show ends and the GRC is completely disbanded, that will be something, but they've created a narrative where, for once, the explicit surface text is that the only way to defeat the real villains is to do something truly radical, and I don't know if they have it in them to land there next week. Still, the show will probably forever have my respect for choosing to be this open about its subject matter. And you know what you could do to earn my respect forever? subscribing, hitting the bell, and sharing this video with others to compensate for the fact that YouTube doesn't put my stuff in people's damn subfeed. Sorry, got a little heated there. You know, I don't know if being a YouTuber is great for my mental health. Anyway, all this stuff honestly rings true of Steve Rogers' own philosophy. As said in something like the end of Civil War, Steve was a guy who put his faith in individuals. Whenever he rubbed up against somebody in the wrong way, be that his villains, Tony Stark, or Nick Fury, they were always directly propping up a system or an institution and letting that override their individual morality. Falcon and the Winter Soldier shows us Sam, a man with those same beliefs trying to make his way not just in a conflict where individuals have been compromised by the system which preys on them, but also in a world that's specifically targeting him systemically for his blackness. It's fascinating stuff. I know some people want to hold the fact that Walker lied about Lamar's killer against him, but I'd be hard-pressed to picture myself doing anything different in his shoes. When both Walker and Carly are at their lowest, however, it's when they're engaging with the system, which honestly doesn't leave them with much other choice. Zemo gets his goodbye this episode, and while that's mainly a scene for Bucky, I think looking at the series through this theme of individuals versus systems makes Zemo's overall role even more layered and fun. A lot of people understandably complained that the retcons made to Zemo's backstory between this show and Civil War undermine his role as an individual actor with an individual grievance in that same movie. The voice of angry, vengeful civilians out to destroy the institution that was the Avengers. I think, for the purposes of this story, that change is deliberate. Zemo, being royalty who grew up privileged, is himself now a voice for institutions, albeit one who, as both a prisoner and the last survivor of his family, has been desynced from that position, however slightly. This makes him a fascinating gray area, at once cogent and helpful, at least from a practical perspective, with a clear respect for both Bucky and Sam, which may actually be on the way to becoming mutual, but also a clear voice for the nuclear option in the Walker and Carly conflicts. One which advocates placing all the blame on Carly and her radical beliefs, and terminating her with extreme prejudice. Zemo raises some good points in a vacuum, but his is a deeply unhelpful perspective, completely counter to what the show seems to be saying is the true solution, and I think it's a perspective the story needs for that reason. So yeah, I'm not team you could have made this show just as good without Zemo. His presence is just too interesting to contemplate. He, more than anyone else, is the show's antithesis. He's not the only one presenting a perspective to foil Sam's, though. And holy hell, the Isaiah Bradley stuff only gets truer and truer to life as it gets more and more tragic. The experimentation, the dismissal of his and his comrades' lives, the fact that they didn't know they were being given super soldier serum, it's nuts. And with plenty of scary real-world precedent for those willing to put in the research. Isaiah straight up did the same thing Steve did back in his own first movie. Back then, he really was every bit a man after Steve's own heart, as Sam is now, and that he could be such a worthy man and yet suffer his lifetime of abuse anyway only makes it more understandable why Sam has been so apprehensive about the mantle. I honestly think that Isaiah is speaking to something Sam's been dealing with internally this whole series. Not just that Sam might not feel worthy to carry on Steve's legacy, but that he's naturally, even if subconsciously, shrinking from the notion of representing a country which hates him. But then, and I love this, we quietly disarm that not just with Sam's own convictions, but also the use of his nephews. It's easy to forget amongst all the revolution and arm snapping and bludgeoning and over-analytical videos like these, but these are, in their bones, characters and symbols for children. And I mentioned last week, Sam himself has something of a naive optimism baked into his character, which the whole genre really needs to have in order to sustain itself. And his nephews are the most literal version of that. A child's blissful ignorance is one that can see that shield, despite the sordid history of the country it represents, despite the fact that it was drenched in blood not 2 days ago, and see it as an unquestioned good. That's a perspective which we all naturally need to temper, but also one we need to cherish, if we can ever hope to take those symbols and make something good out of them. I love the bit with Bucky looking on as the kids play with the shield. Simply by being in Sam's possession, the symbol has regained a level of innocence and rightness. I was really worried that the show would use Bradley's speech as a means of justification to chicken out of Sam being the rightful Cap. What I love is that not only does Bradley's sentiment feel totally justified, But conversely, it's also exactly what Sam needs to hear to finally decide the mantle is his to redeem. Now it's not about Sam being deserving of the shield, it's about him making the shield a tool deserving of him. And he begins the process of doing so with a good old-fashioned 80s training montage. Man, I hadn't realized how much I missed training montages and superhero things. Fixing the boat is where Sam and Bucky really come together and understand each other as men, and dude, I love it. I love it! God, I adore that this story got to slow down and just have this moment. It was a moment the show needed, and it was a moment Sam and Bucky's dynamic needed. Two buddies working on a boat, talking about their feelings, just taking a much-needed break from the plot to be humans for a bit. I love how we open the sequence with Sam calling in favors from his neighborhood. Sam is a man of community, a man of the people, and not only is that key to why he's a perfect Captain America, but it's also just a feeling we don't always get from superheroes and things. Best part of this whole stretch, though, is Sam and Bucky's last conversation. I called it as being a natural part of his arc back in week 2, but a big part of me honestly did not think that Bucky straight up admitting his privilege in plain terms was something that was gonna happen. Admitting that he could never have understood the pressure on Sam as a black man. He comes out right and says what I've been saying about the Shield's purpose for him as an extension of Steve. It's such a great step for their relationship and such a validating thing to see on screen. Not just because Bucky brings the very issue of white privilege into the surface text in a mature, nuanced way, but also that it's just great to see a moment in one of these big action properties where a character stops, admits they've been wrong-headed, apologizes, and is forgiven and seen as none the lesser for it. We live in a world where most people need to better learn the power of just admitting in plain terms that they've been wrong, or have changed their mind, or are sorry for not considering someone else's feelings, and Bucky here is a spectacular example. He's decidedly not a bad person, but he can and should afford to self-reflect and acknowledge when he's let his privilege stop him from properly empathizing with someone else, as should we all. And my gosh, seeing a certain sect of individuals on Twitter lose their minds over this scene because they find the show acknowledging Bucky and Steve's privilege at all to be somehow offensive is simultaneously frustrating and pathetically hilarious. Yeah, Captain America is exactly the same as Iron Patriot, guys. Everything Isaiah Bradley has to say is invalid because the government let a black man drive a red, white, and blue flying tank. Freaking numbskulls, I swear. Also, we confirm that Steve told Bucky his plan at the end of Endgame. I mean, that was always what that movie implied anyway, but I know some people needed that clarification. I still think that it's ultimately true, what I've heard from some friends and peers, that Bucky doesn't really feel like a co-lead in the sense that his journey is decidedly less a point of focus than Sam's. Honestly though, I'm not going to complain about that, and the moments Bucky does get to himself are really, really good. His final conversation with Zemo, leaving things on surprisingly good terms, is really interesting. I think there's a lot to be read into him firing that unloaded gun. Most obviously, Bucky does not have the instinct of an innate killer the way Zemo has slyly insisted he has. We also take another step toward resolving the Nakajima thing, and Sam explains the key to a good redemption arc. More importantly for Bucky though, Sam helps him separate his own self-worth from Steve's legacy. And in doing so, I think the show effectively solidifies Sam as the one true heir to Steve between the two of them. If there was ever a possibility of Bucky taking the shield, it only existed because Bucky himself needed that shield to represent what Steve made it represent. Or else Bucky would have no anchor to the idea of himself as a good person. Sam makes it so Bucky understands the truth, that Bucky has to anchor his self-image with his own actions, not with his quest to appease Steve's ghost. At this point, I think we've absolutely got enough to go on to assume that Sharon Carter is the power broker. It certainly seems like that was Batroc she was talking to on the phone, though I'm surprised we didn't already get the reveal. We've got half a third act left in the show, and structurally any villainous twists would have usually come to fruition already. Granted, having Sam and Bucky in the proactive position they'd need to be in to learn that information would miss the point of this as a breather episode, so I get why we've put that off. Julia Louise-Dreyfus' brief appearance as Princess Angelina Contessa Louisa Francesca Bananafana Bobeska III is weird. Like, I know nothing about whoever this is supposed to be from the comics, and frankly, it's odd to see an MCU property pull the move of having a deep-cut reference character just pop in, name drop, contribute nothing to the actual story, outside of what I imagine is a tease for a future property, and then leave. Like, that's the kind of thing people who only half remember most of the MCU movies would accuse this franchise of doing all the time, but it doesn't actually happen much at all. Like, yeah, there's a possibility Val comes back next week, but for whatever reason that doesn't feel likely. I'd love to be proven wrong, but I think we're gonna end up looking back on her cameo this week as something that should have been a post-credit scene. Apparently she's meant to appear in Black Widow, which was meant to have been out long before now, but I think even with that context, this would have been a weird scene. That aside though, Truth was a spectacular episode of TV, and it gives me a lot more faith than I've had up to this point about where the show will land on at least some of its talking points. But what do you think? Let your voice be heard in the comments, like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the future.